The first thing I noticed was the smell of freshly cut grass from my neighbor's perfect lawn. The second was the 3-foot square he'd never touched, a dark, overgrown patch he treated like a shrine or a cage. When I finally asked him why, his answer began a nightmare that I'm still living in. This happened 2 years ago, right after Sarah and I bought our first house. I'm an architect, and my wife Sarah is a graphic designer, so you could say we were a little obsessive about the details. We spent months looking for a place with good bones, something we could really pour ourselves into and make our own. We finally found it in Crestwood Hills, a quiet, almost sterile suburban development built in the late 80s. The neighborhood had that uniform vibe, lots of beige vinyl siding, perfectly trimmed hedges, and those little mailboxes with family names neatly stenciled on them. It was the kind of place where the only sounds you heard in the morning were the hiss of automatic sprinklers and the distant hum of the freeway. It smelled faintly of cut grass and warm mulch. Our house was a modest 2-story colonial at the very end of a cul-de-sac, which gave us a bit more privacy. It felt safe. That was the word we kept using with each other, with our parents, with ourselves. Safe. It was the ultimate comfort after years of renting apartments in the city. Our next door neighbor was a man named Arthur Abernathy. From what we could tell, he was probably in his late 60s, retired, and lived alone. His house was a mirror image of ours, a blueprint flipped horizontally. But his lawn was a work of art. It was a perfect, uniform carpet of emerald green, the kind you see in advertisements for Scott's Turf Builder. It was pristine. Except for one thing. Right in the middle of that immaculate lawn, equidistant from the street and his front porch, was a perfect 3-foot by 3-foot square of overgrown, uncut grass. The first time I saw it, I figured he just missed a spot, or maybe his mower had run out of gas. It was a strange oversight, but forgivable. But the next weekend, I was out front planting some hydrangeas Sarah had bought, and I watched him mow. He guided his gas-powered Toro with the precision of a surgeon, creating these perfect, satisfyingly straight diagonal lines across the yard. When he got to the square, he didn't slow down or hesitate. He just maneuvered the mower around it in a wide, deliberate arc. He didn't even get close. Sarah and I started laughing about it. It became our little inside joke. We called it the patch. We come up with theories. Maybe it's a portal to another dimension, she'd say while sketching at the kitchen table. Or maybe that's where he buries the bodies of the mailmen who step on his grass, I'd reply. We figured it was just one of those weird old guy things, a harmless eccentricity that made our new, otherwise cookie-cutter neighborhood feel like it had a little character. Looking back now, the word harmless was the first of many, many mistakes I'd make in judging Mr. Abernathy. It was the foundation of a sense of security that was about to be systematically dismantled, one blade of grass at a time. My fascination with the patch didn't start overnight. It grew slowly, like a fungus in a damp, dark corner. I work from home, and my office is on the second floor, with a large window that looks directly onto Abernathy's front yard. It became a kind of living diorama on my desk. At first, it was just a background detail, but soon it became the main event. I started noticing the sheer amount of time and effort he dedicated to his lawn, and specifically to the patch. It wasn't just the weekly mowing. He was out there every morning, usually just after sunrise, inspecting the turf. He'd walk the perimeter of his property slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, looking for weeds or imperfections, but his focus always, inevitably, came back to the patch. He would never ever cut the grass inside it. But his care for it was far more intense than for the rest of his yard. He'd get down on his hands and knees with a pair of antique-looking, long-bladed grass shears, the kind you might see in an old English film, and he would meticulously trim the grass around the perimeter of the square. It was a painstaking process. He would snip, 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 ensuring the edges were perfectly sharp and defined, that no blade from the manicured lawn dared to cross into the wild territory of the patch. It was a ritual. I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation that would put my mind at ease. My architect brain kicked in first. Maybe it was something practical, like a septic tank lid or a wellhead that he couldn't mow over. But the patch was in the middle of his front yard, an unlikely spot for modern septic systems. Besides, when I zoomed in with my phone's camera one day, I could see there was no lid, no metal, just thick, undisturbed grass. Sarah suggested it was a memorial for a pet. That seemed plausible, sweet even. I could picture him as a younger man burying his childhood dog, maybe a golden retriever named Skipper, in that spot. It made sense. But the intensity of the ritual felt like more than just remembrance. It felt like maintenance. Like he wasn't just preserving a memory, he was actively containing something. There was a gnawing feeling in my gut that this was an act of vigilance, not nostalgia. The grass inside the patch was different too. It seemed to grow faster, thicker, and a shade darker than the rest of the lawn. It was a deep, chlorophyll-heavy green that looked almost black in the twilight. When the wind blew across the cul-de-sac, the rest of Abernathy's lawn would ripple and sway, but the grass in the patch seemed heavier, stiffer. It barely moved. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a result of it being longer and denser. I told myself not to be paranoid, that I was just a guy with a new house who was probably paying too much attention to his strange, elderly neighbor. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching something I wasn't supposed to see, a private, obsessive ceremony whose purpose was just beyond my understanding. After a month of living there, I still hadn't actually spoken to Abernathy beyond a polite, distant wave when one of us was getting the mail. He kept to himself, and honestly, we were fine with that. But one Saturday, a bright, sunny afternoon, I was out front wrestling with a new sprinkler head that I just couldn't get to stop sputtering. I was on my knees in the grass, covered in a fine layer of mud and frustration, when a shadow fell over me. I looked up. It was Abernathy, standing at the edge of his property, separated from me by the low line of boxwood hedges that marked our property line. He was holding his grass shears. They looked bigger, more formidable, up close. "Having some trouble there?" he asked. His voice was surprisingly reedy, thin and dry like old paper. It wasn't the voice I had imagined for. I let out a sigh and explained my sprinkler situation, feeling a little foolish. He offered some generic neighborly advice about water pressure and threaded fittings. It was a perfectly normal conversation, the kind you have 100 times in a new neighborhood. But the whole time we spoke, his eyes kept flicking back towards his lawn, towards the patch. It was like he had a nervous tic, a constant need to check and make sure it was still there, still contained. I decided to test the waters. My curiosity finally got the better of my sense of privacy. "You have the best lawn in the neighborhood, Mr. Abernathy," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm trying my best to keep up." He gave a thin, closed-mouthed smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "It's a lot of work," he said. "Demands attention." The phrase hung in the air. Demands attention. I took a breath, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I was always curious about that patch in the middle. Is that a special kind of grass you're growing? His smile vanished. It didn't fade. It was just gone. The friendly neighbor facade dissolved in an instant, like a mask being dropped. His eyes went cold and hard, and his knuckles whitened as he gripped the handles of his shears. He stared at me for a long moment, the silence stretching out, becoming heavy and uncomfortable. The cheerful sounds of the neighborhood, a distant lawnmower, kids laughing down the street, all seemed to fade away. It was just me and him, and the unspoken thing between us. "Some things," he said, his voice low and flat, stripped of its reedy quality and replaced with something heavy, something like gravel, are best left to grow. He then turned without another word, without a nod, or any other social pleasantry, and walked back to his house. The conversation was over. A wave of fear, cold and sharp, washed over me. The kind of fear that prickles the back of your neck. It wasn't just a quirky old man. This was something else entirely. The polite boundary between our yards had just become a battle line, and I had just fired the first shot. That conversation was the spark. My casual neighborly curiosity curdled into a low-grade gnawing obsession. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words, "Some things are best left to grow," played on a loop in my mind. The phrase was so simple, yet so menacing. Around 2 a.m, I gave up trying to rest. I found myself sitting in the dark of my office, the glow of my laptop screen painting my face, typing variations of "leaving a square of grass uncut" into the Google search bar. The internet, in its infinite wisdom, offered a buffet of mundane and bizarre explanations. I scrolled through old, forgotten gardening forums from the early 2000s, the kind with dated layouts and pixelated text. People suggested it could be a soil test plot, an inside joke, or a way to cultivate a specific rare type of sod. Benign explanations that felt completely wrong. Then I found the weirder stuff. I clicked on a link that took me to a paranormal website, and from there I fell down a rabbit hole. There were threads discussing spirit anchors, or ley lines, claiming that a patch of undisturbed, virgin earth could act as a gateway, or, more unnervingly, a prison for entities. There were stories about folk magic, obscure pagan rituals for binding things to the land. I told myself it was ridiculous, the kind of nonsense you read late at night to spook yourself. But the seed of the idea was planted. What if he wasn't keeping people out, but keeping something in? I switched tactics, deciding to look for facts instead of folklore. I started researching the history of our properties. I spent hours on the county assessor's public website, a clunky government portal that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1998. I pulled up old deeds and property records for the entire Crestwood Hills development. I learned that the whole subdivision was built in 1987 on land that used to be a single, large farm owned by a family named the Millers. My research eventually led me to the digital archives of the local historical society, where I found a few grainy black and white photos. One of them showed the old Miller farmhouse. Based on the position of the road and a line of ancient oak trees that were still standing, I figured the farmhouse stood roughly where Abernathy's house was now. The picture was from the 1950s. It was just a house, a leaning barn, and a wide open field stretching towards the horizon. There was no sign of anything unusual, no strange patches of grass. The search was a dead end, and it only deepened my frustration. There was no logical, historical, or even superstitious reason I could find for the patch. And that vacuum of logic made Abernathy's chilling words echo even louder in my head. There was no explanation, which meant the only thing left was his explanation. And I had no idea what that was. Sarah started to worry about me. My obsession was no longer a private, late-night affair. It was bleeding into our days. She'd find me standing motionless at the office window for long stretches, just watching Abernathy's house, waiting for him to emerge. She told me I was projecting, that my stress from the new mortgage and the pressures of my job were making me fixate on our strange neighbor. She tried to be patient. "It's just grass, Alex," she'd say, putting a hand on my shoulder. "Let it go." But I couldn't, because the patch was changing. I was sure of it. The grass within the square wasn't just darker now. It seemed to have a different texture. Normal grass is blade-like, thin. This stuff was thicker, more robust, almost like the reeds you see growing by a pond. And it didn't sway in the wind like the rest of the lawn. It just stood there, unnervingly still, a rigid and defiant block against the breeze. I tried to point this out to Sarah, pulling her over to the window one evening. She stood beside me, squinting at the yard next door as the sun began to set. "Honey, it looks the same," she said gently, her voice full of a careful concern that felt a lot like pity. "I think you're starting to see things." Her dismissal, as kind as it was meant to be, felt like a betrayal. It was the first time this thing, this weird fixation on a patch of grass, had driven a real wedge between us. I felt profoundly isolated, like I was the only one who could see the wrongness of it all, the only one who knew that the placid suburban scene outside our window was a lie. A few days later, my fear was given a new, sickening dimension. It was a hot afternoon, and I saw Abernathy out by the patch. He wasn't holding his shears this time. He was carrying a galvanized steel watering can. He moved with a tenderness I hadn't seen before, watering the square carefully, as if it were a bed of prize-winning roses. But the liquid he poured wasn't water. It was thick and dark, almost black, and as he tilted the can, a faint, coppery smell drifted across the property line and into my open office window. It was a scent I recognized from my grandfather's garden, the smell of blood meal, a nitrogen-rich fertilizer made from dried, powdered animal blood. I've used it myself on tomato plants, but the sheer quantity he was using, pouring gallon after gallon of this dark slurry onto that small patch of earth, felt excessive, sickening. He wasn't just fertilizing it. The careful, almost reverent way he moved, the look of intense focus on his face, he was feeding it. My sleep schedule was completely destroyed. I'd lie awake for hours next to Sarah, her breathing even and slow, while my mind raced, replaying my conversation with Abernathy, picturing the dark, thick liquid he poured onto the soil. The image of him feeding the patch became an intrusive thought, popping into my head while I was drafting blueprints or trying to have dinner. The casual unease I'd felt had metastasized into a constant low-level dread. Sleep, when it came at all, was shallow and unsatisfying. I started getting up in the middle of the night. I'd slip out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and creep into my office. I wouldn't turn on a light. I'd just go to the window and look out at the silent, sleeping cul-de-sac. I was just checking, just making sure everything was normal. I told myself it was for peace of mind, but really it was the opposite. I was looking for proof that things were not normal, and my vigil was soon rewarded. One night, around 3 a.m., I saw him. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale, skeletal light over the manicured lawns and identical houses of Crestwood Hills. The world outside was washed in shades of silver and black, and there, in the center of his yard, was Mr. Abernathy. He was standing directly over the patch, his back to me. He was wearing what looked like thin cotton pajamas, and he was barefoot on the damp grass. He wasn't moving. He wasn't watering or trimming or digging. He was just standing there, perfectly still, his head bowed slightly as if in prayer or deep contemplation. The sight sent a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. My heart started a frantic, muffled drumming against my ribs. I watched him for what felt like an eternity, but the clock on my desk told me it was maybe 10 or 15 minutes. He didn't move a muscle. He was like a statue, a silent guardian posted over his strange, dark plot of land. There was an awful stillness to him, a focused intensity that was terrifying. I felt like I was intruding on something deeply private, something ancient and profoundly wrong. I finally backed away from the window, my legs unsteady. I crept back to bed, my heart still pounding in my chest. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't a memorial. This was a vigil, and I had the sickening feeling that he wasn't just watching over it. He was waiting for something. I knew it was a stupid idea. Looking back now, it was unbelievably stupid. Every rational part of my brain, the part that designs buildings with fire codes and structural supports, was screaming at me not to do it. But my fear had been simmering for so long that it had boiled over into a desperate, reckless need for answers. I couldn't live with the not knowing anymore. I had to know what was in that patch of grass. I waited for a Tuesday morning. From my window, I learned Abernathy's routine. Tuesday at 10 a.m. was his regular grocery day. I watched from my office as his old beige Buick sedan pulled out of the driveway and headed down the street. I waited another 5 minutes just to be sure. My hands were shaking. I went downstairs and told Sarah I was going out to check the mail, a flimsy excuse that she accepted without looking up from her laptop. I slipped out the front door, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I felt it in my throat. The street was empty, the air was still. I scurried across my own lawn, my feet feeling heavy, and vaulted the low boxwood hedge that separated our worlds. Setting foot on Abernathy's perfect grass felt like sacrilege, like walking across an altar. I walked directly to the patch, my eyes darting back and forth, scanning for any sign of a returning car. Up close, it was even more unsettling. The grass was cool to the touch, despite the warm morning sun, and the blades felt unnaturally slick and waxy. I knelt down, my jeans soaking up the morning dew, and parted the thick, reedy blades. The soil underneath was a dark, wet black, almost like potting soil, and it smelled earthy and sharply metallic, like old pennies. I poked a finger into the dirt. It was soft, loose, recently disturbed. And then I felt something, just an inch or two beneath the surface. My fingertip brushed against something hard and smooth. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a rock. It was too uniform, too deliberate in its shape. I started to dig with my fingers, frantically, clumps of the dark, cold soil getting trapped under my nails. The object was just becoming visible, a pale, curved surface, when the sound of a car engine turning onto our cul-de-sac sent the jolt of pure white-hot adrenaline through me. Abernathy was back. He must have forgotten his wallet or his grocery list. I didn't think. I just reacted. I scrambled back, wiping the dirt from my hands onto my jeans, and sprinted back towards my own yard. I dove behind a large oak tree in our front yard, just as his Buick pulled into his driveway. I peeked around the trunk, my heart feeling like it was going to explode out of my chest. Abernathy got out of his car, glanced around the quiet street, and then his eyes settled on the patch. For a second, I was sure he could see the small indentation my fingers had made, but he just gave a slow, deliberate look around before going inside. I slumped against the tree, gasping for breath. The risk had been insane, but I had my answer. Something was buried there. The next morning, I woke up feeling hungover with a fear so potent it felt physical. My head ached, and a sour metallic taste coated my tongue. I kept replaying my idiotic trespass, the feel of the cold soil on my fingertips, the slick surface of whatever was buried there, and the sheer dumb luck of my escape. I went through the motions of starting my day, making coffee, answering a few emails, but I couldn't focus. I just sat at my desk in my office, staring at Abernathy's house, waiting for some sign that he knew. I kept expecting to see him march across the lawn, to hammer on our front door, but there was nothing. just the quiet, unnerving stillness of a suburban morning. The sign came around noon. I went downstairs to make a sandwich, my stomach twisting with anxiety. As I stood at the kitchen counter, my back to the window that looked out on our front yard, I felt a strange prickling sensation on my neck. I turned around and looked outside, and I saw it. There, stuck perfectly upright in the middle of my own lawn, about 5 feet from the property line, was one of his tools. It was one of the long-bladed grass shears, its polished silver blades gleaming in the midday sun. It was planted deep in the grass like a dagger, a strange metallic monument on my side of the yard. My sandwich slid from my hand and hit the floor with a soft thud. I couldn't breathe. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The message was as clear as if he had screamed it in my face. I know you were here. I know what you did. Stay away. My blood ran cold. This was a direct violation, a deliberate crossing of the one unspoken, invisible line that keeps suburban life from descending into chaos. He had come onto my property. He had walked across my grass, my territory, and left his mark. The illusion of safety I had clung to, the idea that the boxwood hedge was some kind of meaningful border, shattered into a million pieces. The game had changed. This wasn't just about his lawn anymore. It was about mine. And he had just made the first move. After the incident with the shears, the thin pretense of suburban normalcy evaporated. Abernathy's behavior shifted from passive-aggressive weirdness to open, silent intimidation. The subtle, unsettling dance was over. This was a siege. He stopped pretending not to notice me sitting in my office window. Now, he would look right at me. He'd be out on his front porch in his rocking chair, slowly sharpening the blades of his shears with a whetstone, the rhythmic shing, shing, shing sound carrying across the yards. And his eyes, cold and dark, would be locked on my window. He would stand in his driveway, watering his rose bushes with a hose, and just stare at our house for minutes at a time, his face a blank, emotionless mask. The psychological pressure was immense, a constant low hum of dread that permeated every corner of our lives. Sarah, who had once been my rational anchor, was now terrified. The sight of those shears plunged into our lawn had shattered her skepticism. She finally saw what I saw. This wasn't just a strange old man. This was a threat. Our home no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a fishbowl, and we were the helpless fish being watched by a predator. We started keeping the blinds closed, living in a state of self-imposed twilight even on the brightest days. The simple act of walking to the mailbox became a source of anxiety. We added a new, heavy-duty deadbolt to the front door and bought a security camera system, the kind you get at Costco, in a big box. I felt like a paranoid lunatic setting it up, aiming one camera directly at Abernathy's front yard, another at our own front door. But the fear was overwhelming. He was turning our dream home, the place that was supposed to be our safe harbor, into a prison. And the most terrifying part was that he was doing it without ever saying another word to me. He was winning. He was isolating us, making us prisoners of our own fear, and all with just a look, a gesture, a silent, menacing presence. The security camera footage only made things worse. I thought having objective proof would be a relief, but it just gave my formless anxieties a sharp, terrifying edge. The grainy infrared footage captured Abernathy's strange vigils in stark black and white, confirming I hadn't been imagining them. He was out there at least 3 nights a week, a ghostly figure standing over the patch in the dead of night, motionless. Reviewing the footage became a new, sick ritual for me. Desperate for something concrete, I drove to the county records office. I was determined to find something, anything, that I had missed online. The office was a quiet, dusty place that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. I spent an entire afternoon hunched over a microfiche reader, the machine humming and clicking as I scrolled through brittle, yellowed newspapers from the 1950s, searching for any mention of the Miller farm. My eyes ached from staring at the glowing screen. And then I found it. It wasn't a big headline. It was a small two-paragraph article from August of 1958, buried in the back pages of the local paper. Local boy missing. My heart leaped into my throat. The article stated that an 8-year-old boy named Daniel Miller had vanished from his family's farm 2 days prior. He was last seen playing in the front yard in the late afternoon. An extensive search of the property and the surrounding woods had turned up nothing. No witnesses, no ransom note, no body. He had simply disappeared. My jaw nearly hit the floor. The microfiche machine hummed, oblivious. I read the article 3 times, my hands trembling so badly that the text swam in and out of focus. The boy had vanished from the front yard of the Miller farm, the same yard where Abernathy's house now stood, the same yard where he stood vigil, the same yard where something was buried under a 3x3 patch of unnaturally green grass. All the disparate, terrifying pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. I didn't know how Abernathy was connected, or if he even was a boy back then. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that little Daniel Miller never left that farm. He was buried in the patch. A week later, a massive thunderstorm rolled into Crestwood Hills. The sky turned a bruised, ugly purple-black, and rain started coming down in solid, driving sheets. The wind howled, a low, mournful sound that rattled our windows in their frames. It was the kind of storm that felt biblical, apocalyptic, like the world was being washed clean. Sarah and I were in the living room, watching the lightning fork across the sky, the flashes illuminating the neighborhood in stark, terrifying detail. During one of those brilliant, strobing flashes, I saw him. A jagged line of lightning lit up Abernathy's yard for a split second, and I saw his silhouette. He was out in the middle of the deluge, wearing a yellow rain slicker with the hood pulled up. He was standing directly over the patch, and he was holding a shovel. My breath hitched in my throat. Another flash of lightning, closer this time, followed by an immediate deafening crack of thunder that shook the whole house. In that flash, I saw him plunge the shovel into the wet earth. He was digging. In the middle of this violent storm, under the cover of thunder and darkness, he was finally unearthing his secret. "Sarah, call 911, I whispered, my voice hoarse, barely audible over the roar of the rain. "What? Why?" she asked, her eyes wide with alarm. "He's digging, Sarah. He's digging it up right now." I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, my fingers fumbling as I tried to open the security camera app. The Wi-Fi connection was spotty because of the storm, but after a few seconds of buffering, I got a flickering pixelated image. It was him all right, a dark hunched figure in the lashing rain, methodically turning over the soil in that cursed square of land. The image froze, then updated. Another shovelful of dark earth tossed aside. Sarah was on the phone with the dispatcher, her voice a mixture of panic and disbelief. "My neighbor, he's digging in his yard." "Yes, right now, in the storm. I think he buried something there, a long time ago." I could hear the dispatcher's tinny, skeptical voice on the other end, but Sarah was insistent, her voice growing stronger. She was a believer now. There was no more doubt. Only a shared, suffocating fear. We watched the flashing screen of my phone, waiting for the police, praying they would get there in time to see what I knew was about to be revealed. It felt like an eternity before the police cruiser arrived, its red and blue lights washing silently and rhythmically through our rain-streaked windows, painting the walls in flashes of panic. 2 officers, a man and a woman, got out, their faces grim under the wide brims of their hats. They walked over to Abernathy's front door, their boots splashing in the puddles. We watched from our window as Abernathy answered, looking calm, almost confused. A frail old man in a bathrobe, woken from his sleep. He spoke with them for a few minutes, gesturing towards his yard with a hand that seemed to tremble slightly. Then, all three of them, Abernathy included, walked out into the rain with heavy-duty flashlights. They went straight to the patch. My heart was pounding against my ribs. This was it. This was the moment of truth. The officers aimed their bright white beams down at the ground. From my vantage point, all I could see was a square of freshly turned muddy earth. The officers poked around in the mud for a minute with the toes of their boots, their movements casual, almost bored. Then they turned and walked back to Abernathy, who stood there with a patient, almost pitiful look on his face, like a man being unfairly burdened by his hysterical neighbors. One of the officers, the man, came to our door. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat onto our welcome mat. "Folks," he said, his voice tired, "your neighbor says he was just turning over the soil to prepare a new flower bed. He said he wanted to do it during the storm so the rain would soften the ground for him. Makes it easier on his back." I started to stammer, my words tripping over themselves. But the history, the missing boy, Daniel Miller, he vanished from that exact spot. The cop sighed, a deep, weary sound that told me he'd already made up his mind. "Sir, with all due respect, we can't go digging up a man's yard based on a local legend from 60 years ago. There's nothing here. Now, Mr. Abernathy is an elderly man, and he's pretty shaken up by all this. We'd appreciate it if you stop harassing him." He gave me a look that was one part warning and two parts pity. The look you give a crazy person. They left. Abernathy went back inside his house. Sarah and I were left standing there in our own hallway, completely and utterly alone, the sound of the rain against the roof mocking us. We had done the right thing. We had called for help, and the system had not only failed, it had turned against us. We weren't the victims here. We were the harassers. We were the problem. In the days following the storm, Abernathy worked on the patch. He didn't plant flowers. The day after the police visit, a delivery truck from a local nursery arrived and dropped off a pallet of fresh sod. He spent the entire afternoon carefully laying down the new squares of grass, patting each one into place like a blanket. When he was done, the square of turned earth was gone, replaced by a perfect, seamless green. Within a week, the new grass had taken root. It grew back thicker, greener, and darker than ever before. Life in Crestwood Hills returned to a terrifying, superficial normal. The police didn't follow up. Our neighbors continued to wave as they got their mail, completely oblivious to the silent war being waged next door. But for us, for Sarah and me, the world was permanently tilted on its axis. The concept of safety, the very reason we'd bought this house, had become a cruel joke. We put the house on the market. Our realtor was thrilled, telling us how quickly homes were selling in the area. But every time a prospective buyer would come for a showing, I'd watch them from the window, and I'd feel a wave of guilt and sickness wash over me. The thought of another family moving in, of another person falling under Abernathy's silent, watchful gaze makes me sick. We haven't sold it yet. Something always seems to go wrong with the offers. I still see him. He's out there every few days with his shears, meticulously trimming the edges of his perfect 3-foot square. The ritual continues, unbroken. I never found out what happened to Daniel Miller, or what connection Abernathy has to him. I'll most likely never get any answers regarding this experience. The questions just hang there, unanswered and unanswerable. Sometimes when Abernathy is out there, he'll look up at my office window. He knows I'm still watching. And yesterday, that's all for tonight's story. Thank you for watching Horror Story. If these kinds of experiences resonate with you, and if you believe that the most terrifying things are the ones that could happen next door, Don't forget to subscribe to Horror Story and hit the notification bell. It helps the channel more than you know and ensures you won't miss the next account. Until then, stay safe and be careful who you trust. You never know what your neighbors are hiding. As a whisper. For me, the whisper was the cheerful, chipped smile of a garden gnome left on my lawn, pointing its little fishing rod right at my house. It was the first sign that my safe new life was a complete and utter lie. My story doesn't start with a scream or a monster. It starts with something small, something you'd dismiss in a heartbeat. This happened last fall, about a year after the accident that made me leave the city. I moved to Havenwood for the quiet, for the feeling of safety that comes with identical houses and trim lawns. The neighborhood had that sterile suburban vibe, lots of beige vinyl siding, wind chimes, and mailboxes with family names stenciled on them. It was supposed to be a place where nothing ever happened, and for a while, it was. I was working from home as a graphic designer, which mostly meant staring at a screen, drinking too much coffee, and trying to forget the sound of screeching tires and shattering glass. My routine was my fortress. Wake up, coffee, work, walk my dog Buster, dinner, sleep. The predictability was a balm on my frayed nerves. On this particular Tuesday, everything was normal until it wasn't. I was taking out the trash, same as every Tuesday evening. The can was at the curb, and as I turned to walk back up the driveway to my front door, I saw it. A single garden gnome. One of those cheap, brightly painted ones you can buy at any hardware store. Sitting perfectly upright on my front lawn. I don't own a garden gnome. I hate them. This one had a cheerful, chipped smile and was pointing a tiny fishing rod toward my house, specifically toward my living room window. My first thought was that it was a prank. Some kids from the local high school, probably. I chuckled to myself, walking over to it. I picked it up. It felt surprisingly heavy, solid ceramic, and tossed it into the recycling bin with a loud clatter. I told myself not to be paranoid. It was a dumb lawn ornament. But as I closed and locked the front door, the image of it stuck with me. The way it was placed, so deliberately, not just dropped, but positioned. The way it was pointing. It felt less like a prank and more like a marker. I spent the rest of the night checking my locks, peering through the blinds every time I heard a car pass. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it fell off a neighbor's truck. Maybe it was a weird gift from a neighbor I hadn't met yet, though that seemed unlikely. You might be wondering why I was taking it so seriously. I honestly think it was because my sense of security was already so fragile. The accident hadn't just left me with a limp. It had taught me that the world could pivot from normal to catastrophic in a single, horrifying second. That little gnome felt like the world starting to pivot again. Looking back now, it was unbelievably stupid how easily I dismissed it. That gnome was the first crack in the ice, the first sign that the fortress of my routine had been breached. It was the first wrong thing, and it was a promise that more were on their way. The gnome incident was easy to dismiss. The town of Havenwood has its share of teenage boredom, and a misplaced lawn ornament felt squarely within the realm of possibility. But then came Mr. Abernathy. He was my next-door neighbor, a man who must have been in his late 70s, living in a house that was slowly being consumed by its own overgrown garden. The paint was peeling in long strips, and the lawn was a jungle of weeds. I'd seen him maybe twice in the year I'd lived there, a fleeting shape behind a dusty window, and that was it. He was the local recluse, the kind of person kids tell ghost stories about. A few days after the gnome, I was at my desk trying to work on a logo design for some new tech startup. My desk faces the street, giving me a perfect view of Abernathy's house. I have this habit of zoning out and staring into space when I'm stuck on a design, and my gaze drifted over to his property. That's when I noticed it. One of the second-story windows, which was always dark and curtained, had its curtain slightly pulled back, and in the sliver of blackness, I could just make out a shape, a silhouette. It was perfectly still, a dark cutout against a darker background. I felt a prickle of unease on the back of my neck. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks after a long day of staring at a bright screen. I focused back on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The feeling was so palpable, it was almost a physical pressure. An hour later, I couldn't stand it anymore. I glanced over again. The silhouette was still there, unmoving. My heart started to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Was he just looking out his window? Or was he looking at my house? Who just stands in a dark room, staring out a window for an hour? I decided to test it. I stood up, stretched dramatically as if my back was sore, and walked into my kitchen, which is at the back of the house, and out of his line of sight. I made a whole show of getting a glass of water, running the tap for a bit longer than necessary. My nerves were screaming. I waited a full 5 minutes, counting the seconds, before I crept back to the edge of the doorway and peeked around the frame. The silhouette was gone. The curtain was drawn fully shut again. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it made me feel dizzy. But it was immediately followed by a new, colder wave of fear. He had moved only when I did. He had been watching me, and he knew that I knew. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just a lonely old man, curious about his new neighbor, a harmless eccentric. But my gut, the same gut that had been screaming at me in the seconds before the car crash, was telling me this wasn't loneliness. It was something else entirely. It was observation. It was intent. And just like the gnome, it was pointed directly at me. For a week, nothing happened. I consciously avoided looking at Mr. Abernathy's house. I kept my blinds mostly drawn, a new habit that made my small house feel like a cave and probably didn't do any favors for my state of mind. My sister Clara called on Thursday, and I mentioned the incidents to her, trying to make it all sound like a funny neighborhood quirk. She didn't laugh. She's a nurse, pragmatic to a fault, and her silence on the other end of the line was heavy.
Leo, you've been through a lot,
she said finally.
Maybe you're just a little on edge.
She was probably right. I was on edge. The accident had left me with more than just a limp. It had left me with a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety, a feeling that the other shoe was always about to drop. I tried to believe her. I told myself not to be paranoid. I forced myself back into my routine, doubling down on the mundane. Then came the first frost of the season. I woke up to a world coated in a thin, sparkling layer of white. It was beautiful in a way that felt sharp and clean. I let Buster out into the backyard, which is fully fenced in, and went to make coffee. When I called him back in a few minutes later, he was sniffing intently at the back gate. I walked over, my mug warming my hands, and saw what had captured his attention. Footprints, fresh human footprints in the frost leading from the gate, which I now saw was slightly ajar. My blood ran cold. The prints formed a perfect, deliberate circle around my entire house. They were close to the walls, nestled right up against the foundation, as if someone had been peering into every single window. The kitchen, the living room, even the small bathroom window. I slammed the gate shut and fumbled with the latch, my hand shaking so badly I could barely work it. The footprints were from a large boot, much larger than my own. They circled the house and then led back out the gate. They didn't lead to my door. They didn't show any sign of attempting entry. It was a surveillance lap, pure and simple, an inspection. I called the police. An officer came, a young guy named Riley, who looked bored and tired. He took my statement, glanced at the fading prints in the now melting frost, and gave me a placating smile. Probably just a local kid. Thought the gate was a shortcut. We'll keep an eye out. He was completely dismissive. He didn't see the pattern. He couldn't see it. The gnome, the watching, the footprints. This wasn't a kid taking a shortcut. This was a deliberate, escalating campaign of intimidation. It was a message, and I had a sickening feeling I knew exactly who had sent it. The quiet man in the decaying house next door had just told me, without a single word, that my fences and my locks meant nothing to him. The police were less than helpful. Their casual dismissal made me feel even more isolated, more convinced that I was on my own. I installed a new heavy-duty deadbolt on the back gate and a cheap set of motion sensor lights I bought from Home Depot. For a few nights, the backyard would periodically flood with blinding white light, triggered by a raccoon or a neighbor's cat, each time sending a jolt of pure adrenaline through me that left me wide-eyed and staring at the ceiling for an hour. I was living on a knife's edge. I started having trouble sleeping, and the exhaustion began to fray my nerves. My work suffered. I missed a deadline for the first time in my career. Clara's voice of concern over the phone started to sound more and more like an accusation. "Are you remembering to take your medication, Leo?" she'd ask, her tone gentle but firm. I was, but the pills didn't seem to be touching the deep, cold dread that had taken root in my chest. One night I was in the living room, trying to distract myself by watching some generic action movie on Netflix. The volume was low. Buster was asleep at my feet, occasionally twitching in a dream. The house was dead quiet except for the movie soundtrack and the low hum of the refrigerator. That's when I heard it, a sound from the basement, directly beneath me. It was a sharp, metallic clang, like a heavy wrench being dropped on a concrete floor. I froze, my hand hovering over the remote. I paused the movie. Silence. I held my breath, listening so hard my ears started to ring. My house is old. Wood floors that creak, doors that stick, the kind of place that always feels a little cold, no matter how high the thermostat is. It makes noises. I told myself it was the water heater kicking on, or the pipe settling, but this wasn't a groan or a creak. It was a distinct, sharp sound, an action. Buster's head lifted from his paws, his ears perked, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He heard it too. That was all the confirmation I needed. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I slid off the couch and grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron skillet I'd left on the stove. I crept towards the basement door, each footstep on the old wood floor sounding like a gunshot in the silence. My hand hesitated on the knob. Every instinct, every fiber of self-preservation was screaming at me not to open it. This was the moment in the horror movie where the audience yells at the screen. But I had to know. I had to know if I was finally losing my mind or if someone was in my house. My hand, slick with sweat, turned the cool brass knob of the basement door. It opened with a low groan that seemed to echo through the silent house. The darkness at the top of the stairs felt like a physical presence, a thick, cold void that smelled of damp earth and dust. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers trembling so much it took me 2 tries to flip it. The single bare bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered on, casting a weak, yellow light over the steep wooden steps. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy. "Is anyone down there?" The only answer was the thumping of my own heart against my ribs. Holding the skillet like a weapon, I took the first step down, then the next. The air grew colder with each step. The basement was unfinished, a concrete box filled with the clutter of a life I'd packed away. Old furniture draped in white sheets like slumbering ghosts. Boxes of books I'd never read again. My forgotten painting supplies from college. Everything looked normal at first glance. I did a slow sweep of the room, my skillet held high, my knuckles white. No broken windows. The small, high casement windows were locked from the inside, their panes thick with cobwebs. There was no one there. I felt a dizzying mix of relief and self-loathing. I was turning into a paranoid wreck, spooked by the groans and clangs of an old house. I was about to head back upstairs, feeling foolish, when my eyes landed on my old workbench. This was where I kept my tools, neatly arranged in a red metal toolbox. The metallic clang I'd heard. It could have been a wrench falling off the pegboard above it, but the pegboard was empty, and the toolbox was closed and latched. Then I saw it. On the dusty concrete floor, directly under the workbench, was a small, crudely drawn symbol. It was a circle with an eye in the center, scratched into the thick layer of dust with a fingertip. It was fresh. I stared at it, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't been down here in months. Someone had been here. Recently. I scanned the basement again, this time with frantic energy, my earlier relief curdling into pure terror. That's when I noticed what was wrong. It wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. I went to a cardboard box labeled College Mementos. I tore it open. A few specific items were missing. A photo album from my senior year, a small box containing old letters from my ex-girlfriend, Sarah. And from my old art supply box, my set of wood carving knives had been taken. Nothing of monetary value. They were things of memory, personal things, intimate things. Someone hadn't just been in my basement. They had gone through my past, and they had taken a weapon. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair in my living room, the cold, heavy skillet on my lap, watching the gray light of dawn slowly creep into the room. The symbol in the basement, the missing personal items, it was undeniable proof. This wasn't random. It was targeted. It was Mr. Abernathy. Who else could it be? He was the one watching me. He must have found a way in, a loose window, a poorly locked door. In the morning, I called Clara, my voice tight with a mixture of terror and vindication. He was in the house, Clara. He was in the basement. I told her everything. The symbol, the missing photo album, the knives. There was a long silence on the other end of the line.
Leo?
She finally said, her voice laced with that careful, professional calm she uses with agitated patience.
I'm coming over. I'll be there in 2 hours.
Her arrival felt less like a rescue and more like an intervention. She walked in, her face etched with a deep, wary concern, and immediately asked to see the basement. I led her down the stairs, my heart pounding, ready to show her the proof, to finally have someone believe me.
We got to the bottom step and I pointed to the spot on the floor. See? Right there.
I said. Claire knelt down, her brow furrowed. The floor was smooth, covered in an even layer of dust. There was no symbol. Leo, where? She asked, her voice gentle. I stared, my jaw slack. It was gone. The dust was completely undisturbed. No, I stammered, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. It was right here, a circle with an eye. I frantically went to the boxes, and the photo album. It was in this one. I tore the box open. The familiar faded blue photo album was sitting right on top. I started pulling out other boxes, looking for the letters, the carving knives. I found them all, tucked away exactly where I would have left them years ago. They were gone, I whispered, my voice cracking.
I swear to you, Clara, they were gone.
She put her arm around my shoulders, a gesture that felt more clinical than comforting.
Leo, listen to me. The accident, a severe concussion, can have long-term effects. Confusion, paranoia, even mild hallucinations. It's not uncommon.
I pulled away from her, a cold anger rising in my chest. You think I'm crazy. You think I imagined all of this. Her face was full of pity, which was worse than disbelief. I think you're scared, and you're not well, she said softly. I think you need more help than I can give you. She wanted me to see a specialist, a neurologist. She was trying to help, I knew that. But all I could hear was that I couldn't trust my own mind. She was telling me the threat wasn't real, but I knew it was. He was just that good. He hadn't just gotten into my house, he'd gotten into my head. He'd put the items back. He'd swept the floor. He was making me look insane, and he was succeeding. Clara left the prescription for a sedative on the counter and the number for a neurologist. I threw them both in the trash as soon as the car pulled out of the driveway. Her visit hadn't calmed me. It had hardened my resolve into something sharp and dangerous. If no one was going to believe me, I'd have to find irrefutable proof. I was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the man next door, and one against the perception that I was losing my grip on reality. I needed to see what he was doing. I needed to watch the watcher. The next day, I drove to a sporting goods store and bought a pair of high-power binoculars. It felt like a point of no return. My own paranoid self had decided to escalate. That night, I waited until well after midnight, when all the lights in the neighborhood were out. I don't mean just nighttime dark. I mean complete blackness. I turned off every light in my own house and positioned myself at my bedroom window, the one with the clearest view of Abernathy's property. The binoculars felt heavy and cold in my hands. I raised them to my eyes, focusing on his house. It was a dark, hulking mass against the starless sky, more of a shadow than a structure. I scanned the windows one by one. Nothing, just black, empty squares. I waited. An hour passed. My eyes burned from the strain. I was about to give up, to chalk it up as another paranoid delusion my sister would pity me for, when I saw it. A flicker of light in one of the downstairs windows. It wasn't a lamp. It was small and bluish, like the screen of a phone or a tablet. It moved, tracing a slow path across the room, as if someone was walking with it. I zoomed in, my heart beginning to hammer in my chest. The light stopped, and for a moment, I could see what was casting it. A figure, silhouetted against the glow. They were looking down at something in their hands. This was it. This was proof. He was awake. He was active. I kept watching, my breath fogging the lens. The figure then did something that made my blood freeze. He lifted his head from the screen and looked directly toward my window. Then he raised his other hand. In it, he was holding something that glinted in the faint blue light from his screen, a pair of his own binoculars. He was looking right back at me. We were two men in two dark houses, separated by 100 feet of manicured lawn, staring at each other through layers of magnified glass. A cold, terrifying understanding washed over me. This wasn't just him reacting to me. This wasn't a lonely old man. This was a game, and he had been waiting for me to make my move. He knew I would. The binocular incident broke something in me. The game was real. He wasn't just watching. He was engaging, anticipating my moves. My fear began to curdle into a strange, obsessive focus. I had to know who he was. Not just the neighborhood recluse, but the man himself. I started digging. I spent hours online, falling down rabbit holes of public records, property deeds, and old news archives from the Havenwood local paper, which had digitized its entire history. It felt like I was building a case file, a profile of my enemy. The house, I learned, had belonged to the Abernathy family for 3 generations. The current owner was Arthur Abernathy. I found a single photo of him, a grainy black and white image from a university newsletter dated 1972. He was a young man with dark, intense eyes and a serious, unsmiling expression. The newsletter mentioned he was a brilliant student of psychology at a prestigious East Coast university with a focus on perceptual anomalies and behavioral conditioning. The phrase sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't some random old man. He was an expert in the very thing that was happening to me. I found articles he had written for obscure academic journals in the late 70s. The titles were chilling. Induced paranoia as a tool for environmental control. Sensory deprivation and reality erosion. Exploiting pre-existing trauma in observational studies. It was a blueprint for psychological torture, written in dry academic language that made it all the more horrifying. It was his playbook, and I was living in it. Then the trail went cold. After 1981, it was like he vanished from the academic world. No more papers, no more university affiliations, just property tax records for the house in Havenwood. He had retreated from the world to, what? Practice his theories on his neighbors? The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I found a small buried news brief from 1983. It was barely a paragraph long. It mentioned a local man, Arthur Abernathy, had been questioned by police in relation to the, quote, unexplained disappearance of his young research assistant. The case went cold. No charges were ever filed. No body ever found. I printed everything out, my hands shaking. The papers were spread across my dining room table, a testament to his malevolent history. Clara thought I was having hallucinations. The police thought I was overreacting. But here it was, in black and white. My stalker wasn't just a creep. He was a retired psychological puppeteer with a very dark past. And for whatever reason, I was his new experiment. Armed with my Abernathy file, I felt a surge of validation. I wasn't crazy. I was a victim. My next move had to be decisive. I couldn't go to the police with a stack of academic papers from the 70s and a grainy news clipping. They'd laugh me out of the station and probably send my sister a concerned phone call. I needed something current, something undeniable. I needed to get inside his house. It was an insane idea, born of sleepless nights and constant, grinding fear, but it felt like the only logical next step. I spent 2 days watching his house, learning his limited routine, a grocery delivery once a week, the mail carrier who always left the mail on the porch without knocking. That was it. He never came out. The house was a fortress. I decided the only way in was to create a pretext, a reason to get to his front door. My plan was simple and, in hindsight, unbelievably stupid. I baked a loaf of banana bread. I put it on a plate, covered it with aluminum foil, and marched across my lawn to his front door. A welcome to the neighborhood offering, a year too late. My heart hammered against my ribs as I climbed his creaking porch steps. The whole place was in a state of advanced decay. Paint peeling, wood rotting underfoot. I knocked on the heavy wooden door. The sound was flat, absorbed by the wood, leaving only silence. I waited, my breath held tight in my chest. I was about to knock again when I heard it, the sound of multiple locks being unbolted, one after another, a slow, methodical process. Finally, the door opened a few inches, stopped by a heavy brass chain. In the dark sliver of the opening, I saw an eye, a pale, watery blue eye surrounded by wrinkled, papery skin. It stared at me without blinking. "Yes?" a voice rasped, dry as autumn leaves. Hi," I stammered, holding up the plate like a shield. "I'm Leo, your neighbor. I baked some banana bread and had extra. Thought you might like some." The eye blinked slowly. It looked from my face down to the plate, then back up. The silence stretched on for an eternity. My arm started to ache from holding the plate. Then the voice spoke again, and the words were not what I expected. "The back door is open," he rasped. "Come around." Before I could respond, the door clicked shut. The locks began to turn again, securing him back inside his fortress. I stood there, stunned. It was an invitation, a trap. He was inviting me into the lion's den. Everything in my body screamed at me to run, to drop the stupid banana bread and flee back to the relative safety of my own home. But a darker, more obsessive part of me, the part that needed proof, was already walking down the porch steps and heading around the side of the house, towards the back door. The back of Abernathy's house was even more decrepit than the front. The back door, as promised, was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I stepped into a darkness that smelled of dust, old paper, and something faintly medicinal and antiseptic. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click, and I was plunged into near total blackness. My eyes slowly adjusted, and I could make out shapes in the gloom. I was in a kitchen, but it was unlike any I had ever seen. The countertops were bare, scrubbed clean. There were no appliances, no utensils, no signs of food. It was sterile, unused. "Mr. Abernathy," I called out, my voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. No answer. I moved deeper into the house, my hand trailing along the wall. The layout was a mirror of my own home, a strange distorted reflection that immediately set me on edge. I entered what should have been the living room. Here, there was a single wooden chair placed in the center of the room, facing a wall. And the wall, it was covered from floor to ceiling with photographs. My breath caught in my throat. They were photos of my house, hundreds of them, taken from his window. Photos of me working at my desk, me getting the mail, me taking out the trash on the night I found the gnome. There were even night vision shots of me sleeping in my bed, my face slack and vulnerable. I felt a wave of nausea and violation so intense my knees buckled. I stumbled back, my eyes darting around the room. And that's when I saw the other walls. They were covered in mirrors. Not regular mirrors, but curved, distorted funhouse mirrors that warped and twisted the room. I saw my own reflection warped into a dozen grotesque shapes, a monstrous, terrified version of myself, multiplied into infinity. In the reflection of one of the mirrors, I saw something else. A flicker of movement from the hallway behind me. I spun around. Standing there, at the far end of the hall, was the silhouette of a man. It was him, Abernathy. He was just standing there, perfectly still, watching me. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, a dark shape in his house of mirrors, as I finally came face to face with my tormentor. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice echoing crazily in the mirrored room. The figure of Abernathy didn't answer. He just stood there, a silent sentinel. My fear gave way to a hot, desperate rage. I lunged forward, intending to tackle him, to make him answer for the psychological torment. But as I ran down the hallway towards him, something was wrong. He didn't brace for impact. He didn't move at all. It was like running towards a statue. I was inches away when I realized the truth. It wasn't him. It was a mannequin, dressed in old, musty clothes. I stopped, my chest heaving, confused out of my mind. What kind of sick game was this? I turned back to the mirrored living room, scanning the walls of photos, my mind racing. That's when I noticed a detail I'd missed in my panic. In the corner of one of the photos, a picture of my own house, there was a small calendar tacked to the wall. The date on the calendar was from 3 years ago, before I had even moved to Havenwood. It didn't make sense. And then my eyes fell on a table in the corner of Abernathy's room. On it was a single leather-bound journal. I walked over and opened it. The handwriting was a spidery, elegant script. It was a journal, Abernathy's journal. The last entry was dated 2 years ago. It read, "The new neighbor seems to be settling in. The trauma from his accident is profound. His case of reverse Capgras delusion is fascinating. He doesn't recognize his own home, his own reflection. He believes he is someone else living in the house next door. I will continue to observe. For his own safety." I read the words again and again. Reverse Capgras. Doesn't recognize his own reflection. Believes he is someone else. My vision began tunneling. I looked up from the journal and stared into the nearest distorted mirror. I saw the terrified face of a man I didn't know, a stranger. But the stranger was wearing my clothes. He had the small scar above his eyebrow that I had. He had my limp. The skillet, the one I thought I'd brought from my own kitchen, was lying on the floor. It had never been in my house. It had been here, in this house, all along. The horrifying truth crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't Abernathy's house. This was my house. I wasn't Leo, the graphic designer living next door. I was Arthur Abernathy, the reclusive old psychologist. And the man I had been hunting, the man I believed was named Abernathy, was a phantom, a projection of the person I thought I was, a young man named Leo who had died in a car crash right in front of my house 2 years ago. I was the one watching the empty house next door. I was the one who had taken the gnome from a neighbor's yard. I was the one who had walked a circle around a house that wasn't mine. I was haunting myself. The world fractured. The foundation of my reality, the very identity I clung to, dissolved into nothing. I stared at my own aged, terrified face in the mirror, the face of Arthur Abernathy, and felt a profound and horrifying disconnect. I was a ghost in my own body. The memories I had of Leo, his apartment in the city, the accident, his sister Clara, were they real memories that had somehow been transplanted into me from the dying man? Or were they elaborate fabrications my broken mind had constructed from the details of the stranger who died on my street? My sister. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I needed to call her, to hear her voice, to anchor myself to something real. I scrolled through my contacts. There was no Clara. There was, however, a Dr. Evans, a neurologist. I pressed the call button, my thumb shaking. A woman answered, her voice crisp and professional. "Dr. Evans' office." "I need to speak to her," I stammered. "It's Arthur Abernathy." There was a pause. "Mr. Abernathy," she said, her tone softening with practiced patience. "Is everything all right? Did you have another episode?" Episode. The word was a key unlocking a door I never knew existed. The man. I whispered into the phone. "Leo. He was in my house." "Arthur," she said, her voice slow and careful as if speaking to a frightened animal. "We've talked about this. Leo isn't real. He's a memory construct, a coping mechanism your mind created after witnessing the trauma of the accident. There is no one in your house. You are safe. Her words were meant to be comforting, but they were the most terrifying words I had ever heard. The photos on the wall, the surveillance, it was my work from years ago. My old unethical research. My mind, in its broken state, had twisted my own past sins into a narrative where I was the victim, not the perpetrator. The missing items from the basement. The symbol. My own hands must have done it, in a fugue state I couldn't remember, leaving clues for an imaginary self to find. I was the architect of my own haunting. I ended the call without another word and sank to the floor, surrounded by the warped reflections of a stranger I now knew to be myself. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the screaming of a man who wasn't there. I don't know how long I sat on the floor. Hours, maybe days. Time had lost its meaning. The police came. Dr. Evans must have called them. They found me sitting in the dark, unresponsive, surrounded by my old research papers and the photos of a life I thought was mine. They didn't see a victim of a stalker. They saw exactly what I was, a deeply disturbed old man who had finally shattered completely. I was hospitalized for a time. They adjusted my medication. They talked to me in soft, reassuring tones. They showed me pictures of myself as a younger man, told me my name was Arthur Abernathy, and walked me through the narrative of my life. I would nod and agree, but the knowledge was a thin veneer over a deeper, more fractured truth. I am home now. The house has been cleaned. The photos and mirrors are gone, replaced by bare, white walls that feel both sterile and suffocating. Dr. Evans calls every day. A home care nurse, a kind woman named Sarah, visits to make sure I've eaten. She talks about the weather and her grandchildren. She doesn't know that sometimes when I look at her, her face seems to flicker, and for a second I see the face of a woman I know as my sister, Clara. The most terrifying part is this. The knowledge of who I am hasn't fixed me. The delusion, the identity of Leo, still lives inside me. He is a voice in the back of my head, a constant whisper that this is all a trick. He tells me that Arthur Abernathy is the delusion, that Dr. Evans is the real villain, and that the man in the mirror is the monster who has stolen my life. I live in a state of perpetual uncertainty. Every morning I wake up and have to consciously decide which reality to believe in. To this day, I still have no idea which parts of my memory, if any, are real. My greatest fear is not that a man is watching me from the house next door. My greatest fear is that I can be standing in a locked room, completely alone, and still not know if I'm safe. I am the violated safe space. I am the unexplained human threat, and I will most likely never get any answers regarding this experience, because the person with the answers is the one I can never, ever trust. That's all for this story. To this day, the details are still a bit fuzzy in my mind, and I still can't wrap my head around all of this. What scares me the most is that I think there really was a threat, just not the one I was looking for. If there's anything to learn from this story, it would be to trust your instincts, but also to question them. Thank you for watching Horror Story. Don't forget to subscribe to Horror Story and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. I'll send an update should something else happen. However, for what felt like a silent professional child abduction, they didn't use guns. They used my rideshare app, a polite tone, and the promise of a big tip to make me their unwilling accomplice. My name is Liam, and for about a year and a half after college, my life wasn't measured in days or weeks, but in pings, fares, and the cold, impartial judgment of the 5-star rating system. I drove for a rideshare app called Drift. I need to be clear about this from the start. It wasn't a career choice. It was an act of quiet desperation, a way to chip away at a mountain of student loan debt while I figured out what to do with a liberal arts degree that was proving to be exceptionally good at gathering dust on my nightstand. My entire world was the driver's seat of my 2018 Toyota Camry, a car I was still making payments on, and my office was a sprawling, quiet network of streets that made up Maple Creek, Ohio. You might have a picture of a place like Maple Creek in your head. It's one of those towns that feels peaceful, almost idyllic, until you spend too many nights driving through its empty, amber-lit neighborhoods. Then you start to see the loneliness and the gaps between the streetlights. You learn the rhythms of the city, not by the sun, but by the app. You learn to categorize the population by its fares. The boisterous, laughing college kids from Maple Creek University heading downtown, smelling of cheap beer and Axe body spray. The silent, weary commuters going home from the late shift at the plastics factory on the edge of town, their exhaustion a tangible thing in the back seat. The couples on awkward first dates who fill the car with a nervous, electric silence. I had a system. I had to. The illusion of being your own boss fades fast when you realize you're really working for an algorithm. I'd start my shift around 5 p.m., catching the dinner and post-work rush. Then I'd power through the bar closing surge around 2 a.m., which was the most profitable and most chaotic part of the night. If I was still short of my self-imposed $150 nightly goal after that, I'd grind it out until 3 or 4 in the morning, picking up the dregs, the stragglers, the service industry workers, the lonely souls with nowhere else to be. This story happened on one of those nights. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of night where persistent, drizzling rain makes the world look like it's melting. The roads were slick and black, reflecting the traffic lights in long, watercolor streaks. Business was slow. By 1:30 a.m., I had only cleared $95, and my eyelids felt like they were lined with sand. I was parked in the overly bright lot of a 24-hour supermarket, the rain drumming a soft, hypnotic rhythm on the roof, scrolling through my phone and trying to decide whether to call it a night and accept the financial defeat. I told myself I'd take just one more decent fare, something over $10, and then I'd head home. I remember the triviality of it all, the utter boring reality of that moment. You know, you always think that a life-changing event will have some kind of grand announcement, some feeling of foreboding, but there was nothing. My world was small, predictable, and contained within the 4 doors of that Camry. I was thinking about how my car needed an oil change and trying to remember if I had enough clean laundry to get me through the rest of the week. That's where my head was at. Just waiting for the next ping. Just as I was about to put the car in drive and head for my apartment, my phone chimed with that familiar Pavlovian ping. A new ride request. I glanced at the screen, the blue and white interface cutting through the gloom of my car. The pickup was about 8 minutes away in a neighborhood called Chestnut Hill. It was a quiet, older residential area on the west side of town, filled with modest single-family homes and established trees. The passenger's name was Sarah, and her rating was a perfect 5.0. In the world of ride-sharing, a 5-star passenger is gold. It means they're polite, they show up on time, and they don't leave a mess. It was always a good sign. The destination was a place called the North Point Industrial Park, a 15-minute drive to the absolute edge of town. It was a little strange for this time of night, but not unheard of. The factory there had a 24/7 operation, and people who worked the third shift often used ride shares. The estimated fare was $12.50. It fit my criteria perfectly. It was the last ride of the night, the one that would push me over my goal and let me go home. I tapped accept, without a second thought. As I pulled out of the supermarket lot, the rain started coming down a little harder, drumming a steady, lulling rhythm on the roof. The drive to Chestnut Hill was quiet, almost hypnotic. I passed darkened houses, the occasional porch light casting a lonely, diffuse glow on a wet lawn. My internal monologue was already running through the post-ride checklist, the mental script I'd performed thousands of times. End the trip, rate the passenger, check for forgotten items, turn the app off, drive home. There was no sense of foreboding, no chill running down my spine. The only feeling I had was a mild, weary relief that my long, slow night was finally about to be over. I turned onto Sarah Street, a lane lined with big oak trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn their autumn colors, though they just looked black and skeletal in the dark. The app's voice guided me to the address. It was a small, neat brick house with white trim, the kind of place you see on a postcard for small-town America. The porch light was on, illuminating a welcome mat and a pot of mums that had been soaked by the rain. It all looked completely, utterly normal. The very picture of safety. I pulled up to the curb, put the car in park, and tapped the arrived button on my phone, sending a notification to Sarah. The app's timer immediately started ticking down the 5 minutes I was obligated to wait. I just sat there, listening to the soft hum of the engine and the steady patter of the rain on the windshield. I remember looking at that warm, inviting porch light and feeling nothing at all. I was just a guy in a car waiting to do a job. I was completely unaware that I had just pulled up to the starting line, that I was about to accept a fare that would take me somewhere far darker than an industrial park, and that my quiet, predictable life was about to end. About a minute after I arrived, the front door of the brick house opened. A woman stepped out from under the warm glow of the porch light, holding a small umbrella to shield herself from the drizzle. She hurried down the short walkway and pulled open the rear passenger side door of my Camry. "Hi, Liam?" she asked, her voice soft and a little hesitant. "That's me. Hi, Sarah," I replied, giving her my standard, friendly but not too chatty driver smile in the rearview mirror. It's a smile I had perfected, a quick, professional acknowledgement that says, "I'm not a threat," without inviting a long conversation. She slid into the back seat, closing the door with a solid thud that sealed us into our own little world. She shook the rain from her umbrella before carefully placing it on the rubber floor mat. She looked exactly like you'd expect a Sarah from Chestnut Hill to look. She was probably in her mid to late 30s, with neatly cut, shoulder-length brown hair and a kind, unassuming face. She was wearing a simple jacket and jeans. She even smelled normal, a faint, pleasant scent of what I think was lavender soap and rain. "Tough night to be out," I said. It was my go-to line for bad weather, a neutral opener that could lead to more conversation or just hang in the air. She gave a small, tired laugh. "Tell me about it. Thanks for coming to get me." I pulled away from the curb and followed the GPS navigation as it guided me toward the industrial park. The first few minutes of the ride was spent in a comfortable, easy silence. After thousands of rides, you get a sixth sense about people. Some passengers want to talk, to unload about their day, or ask about yours. Others just want to be a silent passenger, a piece of human cargo being transported from point A to point B. Sarah was clearly in the latter category. She just stared out her window, watching the rain-streaked houses and blurry streetlights go by. I put on some low-volume instrumental music, my default for quiet passengers. It was enough to fill the silence without being intrusive. I figured she was probably tired, heading to a long shift at a boring job. I felt a small sense of solidarity with her. We were two people awake in the middle of a Tuesday night, doing things we probably didn't want to be doing, just trying to get through it. I remember looking at her briefly in the rearview mirror. Her expression was placid, maybe a little sad around her eyes. There was absolutely nothing about her that raised any red flags. She was a picture of harmless mundanity. And that, looking back now, was the most disarming thing of all. True horror doesn't announce itself with a thunderclap or a monster jumping out of the closet. It wears a normal face. It sits quietly in the back of your car and makes you feel completely at ease, all while the world is tilting off its axis right under you. And you're too busy thinking about the fare to even notice. We were about 5 minutes away from the industrial park, driving along a sparsely populated stretch of road that led out of town. The rain had eased to a light mist that hung in the air, blurring the edges of the trees lining the road. My mind was already on my bed. I was mentally calculating the final fare, picturing myself kicking off my damp shoes and collapsing for the night. It was right then that the routine was broken. A soft buzz came from the back seat, followed by the faint blue glow of a phone screen illuminating Sarah's face in my rearview mirror. She looked down at it, and I saw her expression shift. It was subtle, but it was there. The placid tired look she'd worn the whole ride was replaced by a flicker of something else. Anxiety. Urgency. She took a sharp, quiet breath. "Oh no," she whispered, mostly to herself. Then she leaned forward slightly, her voice now carrying a note of strained apology. "Liam, I'm so sorry to do this. That was my sister. My little niece isn't feeling well, and she needs me to come over right away. Is there any way we can make a quick stop? It's just a little bit out of the way. I'll add a really generous tip for your trouble." This was the first anomaly. A change in destination. You might think this happens all the time, but it's rarer than you'd expect, especially this late at night. It's always a bit of a hassle. Still, her story was completely plausible. A sick kid is a universal emergency. Her tone was apologetic, and the promise of a big tip was a powerful motivator for a driver hovering just under his goal. My internal calculus kicked in immediately. A few extra minutes for what could be a $20 or even $30 tip? In my world, that was an easy decision. "Yeah, of course," I said, trying to sound accommodating. "No problem at all. Just update the stop in the app." "Thank you so much," she said, and the relief washing over her voice felt genuine. "You're a lifesaver." I watched in the mirror as she fiddled with her phone, her thumbs moving quickly across the screen. A moment later, my own phone pinged, and the GPS map rerouted. The app updated with a new stop. The address was for a place called the Oakwood Terrace Apartments, about a 10-minute detour from our current path. After that, the final destination was still listed as the industrial park. I told myself it made perfect sense. She was probably going to drop something off for her sick niece, maybe some medicine or just be there for moral support, and then continue on to her night shift. I was just the driver. It wasn't my business where she went, as long as the app was running and the fare was ticking up. But looking back, I can see that this was the moment. This was the hook, the little lie, plausible and soaked in sympathy, that pulled me off my predictable path and set my wheels on a road that led straight into the dark. The Oakwood Terrace Apartments were on the other side of a set of railroad tracks, in a part of town that was a little more worn around the edges than Chestnut Hill. The complex was a series of long, two-story buildings made of faded brown brick, with exterior walkways and metal railings that were showing faint orange spots of rust through the paint. It was the kind of place that always seemed to have a few flickering, buzzing fluorescent lights in the breezeways, casting a sickly greenish light on everything. I pulled into the half-empty parking lot, which was dotted with wide puddles from the rain. "Which building is it?" I asked, looking around at the identical anonymous structures. "Just right here is fine," Sarah said quickly, almost cutting me off. "I'll only be a minute, I swear. I just have to run this up to her. Do you mind waiting? I'll make it worth your while." "Sure, no problem," I said, reverting to my default customer service politeness. She got out of the car, leaving her small floral tote bag on the seat behind me, and hurried toward the nearest building. She didn't look back as she disappeared up a dark flight of concrete stairs. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. 2:11 a.m. I figured I'd wait 5 minutes, 10 at the most. I leaned my seat back, the engine still humming quietly, and started scrolling through social media on my phone, trying to pass the time. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The initial feeling of obliging patience began to curdle into annoyance. This was cutting into my time, my bottom line, and her promise of a minute was quickly turning into a lie. At the 15-minute mark, I was officially losing money on this ride. I sent a quick message through the Drift app. "Everything okay?" No reply. I sighed, running a hand over my tired face. I considered my options. I could cancel the ride, but then I'd only get a fraction of the fare, and I'd have to deal with her abandoned bag. You're not supposed to just leave a passenger's belongings. I decided to give her 5 more minutes, a final act of goodwill. The complex was eerily quiet, the only sound being the distant, mournful rumble of a freight train passing by. A single window on the second floor of the building she'd entered was lit, casting a pale yellow square onto the wet pavement of the parking lot. I stared at it, and for the first time that night, a vague sense of unease started to creep in. Why was this taking so long? If your niece is sick, you run in. You drop off whatever you have. You give a quick hug, and you leave. The story about the sick niece started to feel thin, flimsy. The whole situation felt off, a sharp deviation from the thousands of predictable trips I'd made. It was the waiting, the deep silence of the complex, the unanswered message. It was the feeling of being in a place I wasn't supposed to be, tethered to a stranger's unexplained delay. The rain-slicked parking lot, which had just been a location a few minutes ago, suddenly started to feel isolated and exposed, and I was sitting right in the middle of it. 20 minutes. That was my limit. My annoyance had now fully bloomed into a quiet, simmering anger. I was being taken for a ride. Literally. I decided I was done waiting. I was going to call Drift support, report an unresponsive passenger, and let them deal with it. As I reached for my phone, my eyes fell on the tote bag she had left on the back seat. It was a simple canvas bag with a floral pattern, the kind you'd buy at a Target or Kohl's. It was partially unzipped. My curiosity, mixed with a growing need to justify my suspicion, got the better of me. Looking back now, I know how stupid this was. But in the moment, I told myself I was just checking to see if her wallet was in there. Maybe find some ID to help support get in touch with her. It was a flimsy excuse, even to myself. I just needed to know. I unbuckled my seatbelt, turned awkwardly in my seat, and reached into the back. I didn't rummage through it. I just hooked a finger on the zipper and pulled it open a little further. What I saw inside sent a sudden, sharp chill through me that had nothing to do with the damp night air. There wasn't a wallet or keys. Instead, nestled amongst some neatly folded clothes was a child's worn brown teddy bear with one mismatched button eye. Next to it was a 3-pack of apple juice boxes and a blue asthma inhaler. the kind for kids. My brain scrambled to make sense of it. The sick niece. Okay, maybe she was bringing her a care package. That was the logical explanation. But then a question formed, sharp and clear and cold. If her sister had only just texted her a few minutes ago to say the niece was sick, why were these items already packed in her bag? Why would she be carrying her niece's personal asthma inhaler with her on her way to work before she even knew there was a problem? It didn't add up. It felt wrong. I tried to rationalize it. Coincidence. Maybe the kid left it in her car earlier that day. Maybe she was planning to drop it off tomorrow anyway. But the explanations felt hollow, like lies I was telling myself to stay calm. The presence of that specific inhaler, a medical necessity, felt significant. It felt premeditated. In an instant, the bag transformed from a simple, forgotten item into a piece of evidence. Evidence of what, I had no idea. But the vague sense of unease I'd been feeling for the last 20 minutes solidified into a cold, hard knot of genuine fear in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't a normal fare. This wasn't a simple delay. Something was very, very wrong. And I was sitting right in the middle of it. My heart was starting to pound a low, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I quickly zipped the tote bag shut, my fingers feeling clumsy and numb. My flight or fight response was screaming at me to just drive. Just go. Leave the bag. Report it later. Get the hell out of there. My hand was on the gear shift, ready to slam the car into drive and peel out of that parking lot for good, when the rear driver's side door was pulled open. I flinched so hard, I hit my head on the cold glass of the window. I whipped around to see a man sliding into the back seat as if he had every right in the world to be there. He was probably in his 40s, with short, neat brown hair, and he was wearing a dark, well-fitting jacket over a collared shirt. He looked like a high school principal or an accountant, utterly normal. He closed the door quietly, the sound unnervingly soft, and settled into the seat. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice completely calm and even. "Change of plans. She sent me." He didn't offer a name or an explanation. He just spoke with a placid, unnerving authority that didn't match the situation at all. My mind was a chaotic mess of confusion and rising panic. Who the hell was this guy? Where was Sarah? What? I stammered, my own voice sounding weak and distant to my ears. "New destination," he said, ignoring my question completely. He looked past me, out the front windshield into the dark, rainy lot. "We're heading to 1125 Winding Way. It's over in the Mill Creek subdivision." He spoke the address as if I had already agreed to take him, as if my role as the driver in this bizarre transaction was a settled fact. His sudden appearance, his calm demeanor, his complete disregard for the inherent strangeness of the situation, it was all profoundly disorienting. I was frozen, caught between the instinct to demand answers and the deep, primal fear of what those answers might be. He wasn't overtly threatening, but his presence felt like a total violation. He had entered my space, my car, without permission, and was now acting as if he owned it. I can't just, I started to protest, my voice trailing off. He finally turned his gaze to me. His eyes were flat, brown, and utterly emotionless. "The trip is still active, isn't it?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. It was a statement of fact. "Just drive. Sarah will compensate you for the extra time." His tone left no room for argument. It was a command wrapped in the thinnest veil of a polite request. And in that moment, paralyzed by a specific kind of fear I couldn't yet name, I obeyed. My hand, which a moment before had been ready to flee, now put the car in drive. I pulled out of the parking lot, away from the apartments and the flickering fluorescent lights, and into an even deeper, more terrifying darkness. The man was surprisingly talkative, but his conversation felt hollow, like a script he was reading from a teleprompter, only he could see. He asked me about my night, how long I'd been driving for Drift, the usual passenger small talk. It felt completely calculated, a deliberate attempt to put me at ease, to normalize the utterly abnormal situation we were in. I gave short, mumbled answers, my eyes constantly flicking between the road and the rearview mirror, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Tough gig, I bet," he said, looking out the side window at the dark, passing scenery, dealing with all sorts of people at all hours. "It has its moments," I managed to say, the words feeling like gravel in my mouth. Then he made his mistake. He glanced over at the floral tote bag still sitting on the seat next to him, where Sarah's umbrella had been. He gestured at it with his chin. "Glad she remembered to bring that," he said with a casual, almost fatherly chuckle. "The little one can't sleep without her Mr. Snuggles." The world stopped. For a split second, there was no sound, no rain, no engine hum. Just those two words. "Mr. Snuggles." My blood went ice cold, because when I had looked in that bag, I had seen the teddy bear. It was brown, worn, with a single black button for an eye, and sewn onto the little red ribbon tied around its neck in faded, loopy cursive was a name tag. I had seen it clear as day under the dim interior light. The name wasn't Mr. Snuggles. The name was Barnaby. It was such a small detail, a tiny, insignificant error, but in the context of everything else, Sarah's sudden disappearance, this man's arrival, the premeditated feel of the inhaler in the bag, it was a seismic event. It was the final, irrefutable proof that this was all a lie, a carefully constructed, premeditated lie. They weren't just disorganized or forgetful, they were deceptive. And this man, this calm, well-dressed man in my back seat, was a part of it. His casual confidence was no longer just unnerving, it was predatory. The small talk wasn't friendly, it was a form of control, a way to keep me docile and unsuspecting. I didn't say anything. I just kept my eyes fixed on the road, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He had no idea the mistake he just made. He had no idea that with two simple, wrong words, he had peeled back the curtain and shown me the monster hiding just beneath the skin of normalcy. I was no longer a driver. I was a witness. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that was a far more dangerous thing to be. We drove in silence for a few minutes after his comment about the teddy bear. The only sound was the rhythmic swish of the wiper blades and the quiet hum of the tires on wet pavement. The man seemed perfectly content, occasionally glancing down at his phone. I was anything but. My mind was a frantic storm of what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. I was trying to figure out what I had stumbled into. It felt like an abduction, but it was so clean, so quiet, so unnervingly professional. Then, his phone rang. It wasn't a cheerful ringtone, just the professional, sterile buzz that cut through the quiet of the car. He answered it immediately. "Yeah," he said into the phone, and his entire demeanor transformed. The fake, friendly passenger was gone completely. In his place was someone cold, efficient, and dangerous. His voice was clipped, all business. "Is it done?" He paused, listening. A thin, cruel smile touched the corner of his lips. "Good. No, he's with me." He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, our eyes met. His were like chips of ice. "He's compliant. We're about 10 minutes out." Compliant. The word hit me like a physical blow. He was talking about me. I wasn't a driver providing a service anymore. I was an asset being managed. I was a tool being used in their plan, whatever it was. I was just compliant. He listened for another moment, then said, "No loose ends. I'll handle it. See you there." He hung up. He didn't put the phone back in his pocket. He just held it in his hand, his thumb resting on the dark screen. He didn't look at me again. He just stared straight ahead, as if I was nothing more than part of the car's machinery, the part that steered. The fear that had been a cold, hard knot in my stomach now exploded, flooding every part of my body with ice. This was no longer a suspicion. This was real. I was an unwilling participant in a serious crime. The phrase "no loose ends" echoed in my head over and over. I was a loose end. The most dangerous loose end of all. I was the one person not in on their plan, who knew their faces, who knew the car I was driving, who knew the route we were taking. The $15 fare, the hope of getting home to my bed, it all seemed like a joke from another lifetime. My only goal now was survival, and I had the sickening feeling that my chances were getting slimmer with every mile we drove. Those next 10 minutes were the longest of my life. The interior of my Camry, which was usually my safe space, my mobile office, my little bubble of solitude, had become a cage. The man in the back seat was silent now, but his presence filled the entire car. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. Every little sound was amplified. The soft tick of the turn signal, the gentle splash of the tires through a puddle, the quiet hum of the climate control. It all sounded deafeningly loud. The city lights of Maple Creek, normally a comforting sign of life in the dark, now seemed alien and menacing. They illuminated a world that I was no longer a part of. I was in a separate reality, a bubble of quiet terror, driving through the sleeping town. My mind was a high-speed, chaotic slideshow of escape plans. I could slam on the brakes in the middle of an intersection and just run. I could swerve into a ditch. I could crash the car into a telephone pole. But what then? He was right behind me. What if he was armed? The line from the phone call, "I'll handle it," suggested he was prepared for complications. For me. My own body was betraying me. My hands were slick with sweat, making the steering wheel feel slippery and foreign in my grip. My legs felt weak and shaky on the pedals. My breath was shallow, and I could feel my heart thudding against my ribs with a frantic, unsteady rhythm. At one point, I saw a police car cruise by in the opposite direction, its red and blue lights off, just on a routine patrol. My heart leaped with a desperate, painful hope. I wanted to flash my high beams, to honk the horn, to do anything to get its attention. But I couldn't. The man was watching me. I could feel his eyes on the back of my neck. I knew that any sudden, erratic move would be the last one I made. My drive would be over in a way I didn't want to imagine. So I just drove. I kept my speed exactly at the speed limit. I used my turn signals at every turn. I stopped completely at every stop sign. I was a model driver, a perfect compliant tool. I was driving myself to a destination I didn't know, to an outcome I feared would be my last. Each passing street sign, each green light, was another step closer to the end of the line, and all I could do was steer us there, my hands locked on the wheel like a condemned man. The GPS voice calmly announced, "Your destination is on the right." 1125 Winding Way was in a newer upscale subdivision called Mill Creek. The houses were large and set far back from the road, with perfectly manicured lawns that looked like dark green carpet under the streetlights. It was the kind of neighborhood that projected an image of safety and affluence, a place where nothing bad was ever supposed to happen. The house itself was a big 2-story modern colonial, completely dark except for a single, warm light glowing on the porch. I pulled up to the curb, my entire body rigid with tension. "Okay," the man said, his voice once again calm and even, as if we had just arrived for a friendly visit. "Wait here." He got out of the car and closed the door softly. My first instinct, the primal urge, was to floor it, to leave him standing there and just drive until I ran out of gas. But his final words, "wait here," felt less like an instruction and more like a test of my compliance. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the accelerator, my mind screaming. Before I could make a decision, a dark SUV with tinted windows pulled into the house's long driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness and sweeping across my car. It came to a silent stop. My car's engine was the only sound on the otherwise dead silent street. The passenger door of the SUV opened and Sarah got out. She looked exactly the same as when she'd left my car what felt like an eternity ago. She walked quickly to the back door of the SUV. The man from my car met her there. Another figure, whose face I couldn't see in the shadows, opened the other back door, and then I saw them lift a small child out of the car. It was a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, wearing pink pajamas. She was sleepy and compliant, rubbing her eyes with a tiny fist. In her arms, she clutched a worn brown teddy bear, Barnaby. My blood went ice cold. They didn't drag her. They didn't force her. They led her gently by the hand, up the manicured walkway, Sarah on one side, the man on the other. They looked for all the world like a normal family bringing their tired child home late at night after a long trip. They unlocked the front door, guided the little girl inside, and then disappeared into the house, closing the door behind them and leaving the porch light to cast a lonely, mocking glow on the empty walkway. The quiet, horrifying efficiency of it all made me feel sick. This wasn't a violent, chaotic kidnapping you see in movies. This was a planned, precise, and silent extraction. In my Toyota Camry, my little mobile office had been the first stage of the operation. I sat there in the deafening silence of the suburban street, my mind struggling to process the scene I had just witnessed. It was so clean, so calm, so devoid of the chaos I would have expected. It felt unreal. A moment later, the man emerged from the house alone and walked back toward my car. My entire body tensed. This was it, the no loose ends part. He wasn't going to just let me drive away now. He walked to my passenger side window. I didn't dare roll it down. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had turned white. He didn't knock. He simply opened the passenger door, leaned in, and placed a small, heavy object, wrapped in a white cloth napkin, on the empty seat next to me. He didn't hand it to me. He just set it down with a quiet finality. He looked me directly in the eyes. His gaze was flat, assessing, like a biologist studying an insect. It was the look of a man who was used to solving problems permanently. "You're a good driver, Liam. You see a lot of things. You pick people up, you drop them off, but you don't remember faces. You don't remember addresses. You were never here tonight. You understand?" His words were a clear, unambiguous threat, delivered with the sterile precision of a surgeon. This was the semantic core of their world. Actions have consequences, and silence has a price. "If you understand," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, "you'll find the rest of this payment in your bank account in a week, untraceable. If you don't, well, we know where you live. Your app tells us everything, your name, your address, your picture, everything." He straightened up and closed the door gently. He didn't look back. He walked to the black SUV, got in, and it pulled out of the driveway without a sound, its taillights disappearing around the corner. leaving me alone in the oppressive dark of that wealthy, silent neighborhood. The threat hung in the air, more terrifying than any weapon. They didn't need a gun. They had information. They had my life, neatly packaged in my Drift driver profile. The very tool I used to make a living, the app that connected me to the city, had become the leash they now held around my neck. In that moment, the illusion of my own safety was shattered into a million pieces. I was completely, utterly exposed. I don't remember the drive home. It's a complete blank in my memory, a pocket of time erased by sheer, undiluted terror. The next thing I knew, I was parked in my designated spot at my own apartment complex, the engine off, my hand shaking so violently I could barely unbuckle my seatbelt. I stumbled into my apartment and locked the door, leaning my full weight against it as my legs finally gave out. I slid to the floor, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. I stayed there for a long time, just listening to the sound of my own frantic heartbeat in the silence of my apartment. Eventually, the adrenaline subsided, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its place. I looked at the cloth-wrapped object I had carried in with me. With trembling fingers, I unwrapped it. It was a thick, dense roll of $100 bills held together by a single, tight rubber band. I'd never seen so much cash in one place. I counted it. $10,000. A down payment. Next day, I deleted the Drift app from my phone. I called their support line and told them I was deactivating my account for personal reasons. I never drove for a rideshare service again. I never received the rest of the payment, and a profound, sickening relief washed over me when the week passed and my bank account remained unchanged. I took the cash and hid it in an old shoebox in the back of my closet. I couldn't spend it. It felt like poison, like blood money. For weeks, I obsessively scoured the local and national news, searching for any mention of a missing child, an Amber Alert, a custody dispute gone wrong. Nothing. There was never a report. The police never announced an investigation. The little girl in the pink pajamas, holding her bear Barnaby, had vanished from the world without a trace. Or perhaps she'd been returned to it. I will never know. I don't know if I was a party to a rescue or an abduction. I don't know if Sarah and the man were grieving parents taking back what was theirs or monstrous criminals stealing a child. That silence, that ambiguity, is the most terrifying part of the whole story. It's been 2 years. I have a normal job now, an office job with a regular paycheck and benefits. But I am not the same. Every time a car I don't recognize parks on my street for too long, my heart seizes. Every time my phone rings from an unknown number, a cold sweat breaks out on my neck. The money is still in the shoebox, a heavy, rectangular reminder of my compliance. They showed me that the world I thought I knew, the world of rules and consequences and safety, is just a thin, fragile veneer. And underneath it is another world, a world that operates on its own, silent, brutal logic. I was a loose end they chose not to tie up, and I have to live every day with the knowledge that they know exactly where I am. I was just a driver. I picked someone up and I dropped them off. And it ruined my life. Thank you for watching Horror Story. That's all for tonight's story. It's strange how a single ordinary decision, like accepting one last fare for the night, can completely shatter your sense of safety. I still think about that night, about the unanswered questions that will probably haunt me forever. What really happened to that little girl? Was I helping her or harming her? I'll likely never know. If you have a story about a time your gut instinct told you something was deeply wrong, I'd be interested to read it in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to Horror Story and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next unsettling account. Until next time, stay safe out there and always trust that feeling in your gut.